Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Power Word Heal video. So this one is going to be about the newly announced Season of Discovery, and it's basically going to be just kind of like, I don't want to say a rant, but sort of just like my thoughts on it. Kind of like off the cuff a bit, nothing like too pre-planned, but it just came out and there's kind of a lot of different opinions on it, so I'm going to give mine. And some of it's going to be from the healer perspective, but this one's going to be a bit more generalized. So it's going to cover, just kind of like the whole game or season and what I think of it based on what we've heard so far. And obviously keep in mind that, some of this stuff may change because we don't have all the information, right? But, I think that it's reasonable to, I don't want to say like jump to conclusions, but it's reasonable to try and like ascertain whether or not you're going to like something or not based on the information given, right? And in other words, if there's information that's left out that would fix like a glaring misconception about something you're putting out, that's and that information is not released, then that is, I feel like, kind of on you, right? Because people can only make choices and decide if they like things or not based on the information provided. We can't read your mind, etc. So yeah. So I have to admit, when it first got announced, it was kind of like, it was a bit of like a gut punch, not to be like over dramatic, but when they said mage healer and like warlock tank, it basically kind of elicited some like very visceral reactions, like what is going on here. And I think everybody that was going into BlizzCon that cares about this WoW Classic related stuff and the era side, we all knew we were getting something, right? Because they had announced prior that we were going to be getting like a season 2 essentially. And that's actually why I personally didn't really think we were getting Classic Plus, because they had specifically announced Season 2, and like they were pretty explicit about it, because they said like, it's not, everybody was saying Psalm 2 at the time, and even the people saying Psalm 2 obviously knew it wasn't going to be Psalm 2, right? Because Psalm 2 is, that's Season of Mastery, so it wouldn't make sense to have Season of Mastery 2. It was just kind of like the euphemism or word they're using at the time to describe the new season, whatever season 2 would be. So we knew it would be something different, and they basically like confirmed that back when around Hardcore was being launched. And so we knew we were getting something, and I figured it would be a season. I didn't think it would be Classic Plus, but I was fine with that. I kind of like the idea of like what a lot of people were talking about with Classic Plus, but I was basically just fine with like a new season. Maybe like they fix some of the really bad class balancing, like make the memes like a little bit better. You know what I mean? Potentially give some classes some better filler spells, particularly I was thinking of like Mage and Rogue. And then if you're going to fix the memes, you would probably give them some filler spells as well, to make the gameplay a little bit more dynamic. And I thought that was pretty much going to be the extent of it. Maybe keep some of the Season of Mastery changes, shift some of the ones around. I can actually do videos on what I thought of Season of Mastery and stuff like that in a retrospective. But yeah, I didn't think it would be like that much, because Season of Mastery wasn't really like a stark departure from original vanilla. Like, obviously, as a purist, some people would take a lot of issues with me with things that were done in Season of Mastery, but I think overall it was pretty benign. Most of the changes were relatively good, and but they were kind of like much smaller, at least much smaller compared to Season of Discovery. We didn't hear anything about mage tanks or mage healers, sorry. And yeah, that really threw me. And then I hear about the rune system, and I'm like, okay. But then I start seeing some of the runes, and they seem a bit crazy, right? And then, shortly after, we're getting these, like, infographics appearing on Reddit, where they have, like, all the runes for the classes and stuff like that, and it's a bunch of like retail abilities, and it was a bit concerning. And I want to like take a moment to kind of like establish how I feel about the whole classic versus retail thing, because I think that's kind of like important going forward. Where I'm not like a retail hater. You know, I played retail for pretty much since the game, like in actual Classic came out. I played basically every expansion. Didn't really play Kata that much. Just like it was not really anything specific about Kata. It wasn't even like the hatred of Kata. It was more just like time. It was like the period in my life sort of thing. But you know, I did play pretty much like all the WoW expansions up until like I think Shadowlands, and then whatever a Dragonflight is like the newest one. So I didn't really play like those two too much. I kind of got off the retail train then, but I played retail for quite a while. So I'm not like a retail hater by any means. I just think that there's a lot of systems in WoW Classic that I prefer to retail, or certain aspects of the game that I think allow for like more freedom than retail, where retail has taken like the theme park and gone crazy with it. You know, like you're super directed, I feel like, and super linear now in retail, and WoW Classic is just like a lot more open-ended and feels a lot more like an actual MMO, which I like. So that's kind of like my discrepancy between or that's like how I feel about both games. I don't dislike retail. So I guess like the reason why I'm saying that is that the addition of retail abilities into WoW Classic, I don't think is inherently a bad thing. It can be a bad thing depending on what's added, right? But I think a lot of us were even thinking about Classic Plus in any sense of Classic Plus. Part of that was going to be that some classes were going to get some new abilities. You know, like, and that was going to be explicitly to fix certain issues that the classes had that you really probably couldn't fix without adding more abilities, right? So, for example, Mage in PvE, you know, it's quite boring. You could argue that, like, once you get to AQ and Nax, then you're playing the Fire Spec, things are a bit more involved, and there's more communication required to some degree, but especially, I don't even think that is really, you know, super difficult or engaging for a lot of people, but if that's not engaging, then the Frostbolt spam in the earlier instances certainly isn't engaging. You know what I mean? And like min-maxing is basically like trying to get your Fire Blast off to like pad damage on the mob to pad your overall, you know? And then like Rogue is just spamming Sinister Strike essentially and keeping Slice and Dice up. And then like sometimes you're asked to expose and sometimes you're not. And then Daggers is backstab. And yeah, so some of the classes are very, very simple, and it's no shock to me that a large contingent of players in Classic always go to Warrior. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because Warrior to me is kind of like the most retail-like class there is, because it kind of has like the most stuff to do in terms of pressing buttons. And like, we'll just get ourselves a nice scenic view here. We'll go to Light's Hope. We'll probably get ganked when we land there. But yeah, I think Warrior is basically just kind of like the most retail-like class. It's the most involved, has the most like uptime, the most button presses, etc. And it's obviously the most powerful, but I think actually people would still play it even if it wasn't the most powerful, because it's just more fun to play than like Rogue and stuff. It does cleave, which a lot of classes have like limited access to, and stuff like that. So it wasn't a surprise in my mind that we're gonna get new abilities, right? But I guess I kind of expected them to be more PvE tailored and less PvP tailored. Not that all of them are PvP tailored. Like, you can probably tell by looking at them, a bunch of them are PvE tailored, but a lot of them are going to have like cross uses, I think, in PvP. and it'll be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. But I really think that the PvP in Vanilla WoW is actually pretty engaging, to be honest. And there's something about the game where like everything's a bit slower, but you need to like kind of think more about every action that's kind of you're putting onto the table. So I'm a bit concerned, honestly, with like all the abilities that are coming in terms of just like the balance of power. A lot of people like to say that vanilla PvP is very imbalanced, and I understand like why they feel that way to a degree. But I think that the balance is actually pretty good in terms of when you look at it in terms of roles. So when you look at it in terms of individual classes, the power balance can seem like really skewed. It's like, especially if you're playing one of the classes that isn't so good at 1v1s, you'd be like, I lose to this, I lose to this, I lose to this, and this class seems to beat almost everything, and like, why am I losing here, etc. But I think like if you were to take each class and look at like how they kind of like plug into like a Warsong Gulch, for example, you find that each class does have kind of like a distinct role, and there are things that every class is kind of like good at and is better at other classes than doing. Paladin and Shaman both feel very distinct, which is good. That was kind of like the goal, right? It's the whole point of having the different factions. So I think there's a lot of good in original vanilla PvP, and I think right away I just see all these abilities coming into the game, and it's very concerning because I'm not afraid of disruption and like learning new things necessarily, right? But it's not going to be fun if one of these classes, through certain combinations of these runes, and keep in mind we don't have all of them yet, right? So we may get even more, becomes just like really, really powerful and oppressive, right? That's kind of like my concern. And I think that it's more likely to happen when you kind of add all this stuff into the game at once, which is why I'm a much bigger fan of like iteration. And that's kind of what I thought we were going to get with like season 2. It's like we were going to get class changes. I was wholly expecting class changes, but I thought it was going to be more iterative and on a much smaller scale, right? And it was going to be more PvE focused for sure. Where like I would have even been fine with them giving abilities that like essentially do less damage in PvP, that were purely like, them kind of coming out and being like, look, this is for when you go into Molten Core for it to feel more fun, right? But you're not fucking using Mutilate and Envenom on somebody in the wild, for example. So that's kind of what I was anticipating, and I thought it was going to be like a much more gradual ease in. Kind of like, we're going to add these things, see how it feels. Maybe we'll update mid-season even, if we have the team and staff to do that, or maybe next season we'll take it further if we feel like the class is still too weak relative to what we're looking for, etc. But this was just like a shock to the system for sure. Like I was waiting for Killing Spree to pop up, you know what I mean, when I was looking at some of the rogue stuff, and hey, we may even get it still, right? I was looking for Fan of Knives. I was like, wow, like I looked at the Druid and I was immediately looking for Starfall. I was like, this is like the premier retail ability. But I guess like when you look at their how they presented at BlizzCon, they did try and keep in mind that not all these things would fit, quote unquote, in Classic. So they did seem to pull their punches a bit there. But I am curious to see like what's to come. So yeah, that was my first impression. Definitely a bit concerned, and I think it definitely got better over time, in the sense that when we learned how the runes worked in terms of being plugged into certain slots, that made it a little bit better, right? Because now we're seeing like, okay, there's 3 abilities here, but we're not getting them all. We have to pick one. And I do like systems like that, generally speaking, where you have to pick things. I'm not sure if I'm a huge fan of being able to swap them so easily. Just like you have to be out of combat is the only stipulation. I mean, I think the ability to swap them is good in general. Right? You don't want to like probably lock somebody and they have to make a new character to use different runes on it. That might be a bit too harsh. But I think maybe having like some type of barrier that's not just being out of combat would probably be preferable. So you can't necessarily just like hot swap. I remember in some of the later retail expansions with like talents, that's kind of like how that new talent system always worked, right? Where you'd have like the 3 talents in a row, and it just felt like I used to play like Hunter and Warlock, and it just felt like you kind of always customize yourself and tailor yourself to the fight, which is kind of cool in a sense. Obviously, like the min-maxer in me loves that, but at the same time, it's kind of like I think it can be fun to have the strengths and weaknesses. Like, hey, I'm gonna be like amazing on this fight, but you know, like I know, and to do that, I'm giving up this in these other areas, and I think that makes the balancing kind of like a bit more interesting, and the choices a bit more meaningful. But I think just the fact that the amount of abilities is being limited by the runes is kind of a good thing. It's just a question of like how many rune slots are we gonna get, right? And it seems like we're definitely gonna get more. I think when they say we're going to get runes, I think they also mean rune slots. I would kind of be fine with them adding a bunch of runes if their amount of slots stood the same. But I think we're definitely getting new slots, and hopefully we're not getting a slot or a glyph slot for like every piece of gear, because that's insane, right? There's like just way too many, I think. And it would probably be like ability overload. So we'll see though. But I anticipate a couple more for sure. So yeah, that's kind of like my thoughts on the rune system. And then the other big point of contention is like the level cap, right? And this is not a new idea. It's definitely been floated around in the past. People were talking about it with Season of Mastery. And I think it was kind of spawned off of people playing vanilla, because people, when they were playing vanilla, a lot of people had that sense of like, oh wow, like these people got to 60 so fast. Because obviously in the first iteration in 2004, you know, it took everybody kind of like a while to get to 60, and that's for a ton of reasons. It was also like due to the patch we were on, but primarily like nobody knew what was going on, right? So when these players, they see people like hitting 60 on a mage in like 3 or 4 days in OG vanilla or whatever it was, and they see like, what was it, apes killing Ragnaros on day 6, they feel like perma behind. You know what I mean? If you're like a casual player that works a full-time job and stuff like that, you're just like, wow, they just killed like the last boss and they're already farming their gear, and it's going to be like probably at least like 5 to 6 weeks for me to even get there and start doing that. So they're going to have 5 to 6 weeks on me, and that's like in addition to everything else they've done, you know, besides doing the raid and stuff like that. So I understand the inclination to go for like a level lock system, and in some regards, like, I don't hate it, but I think that the best thing to do in these types of situations, and the most like the way to do it that doesn't feel as bad for the player base on the whole, is that you lock the raids instead of locking the level. So for example, like, I'm much more in favor of, you know, like Molten Core just doesn't come out for like 2 weeks, or you could even do a month. Like, I actually proposed that for a Season of Mastery, and when they're asking for suggestions and stuff like that, like, I was totally on board with that. Like, I'm fine. Like, I think that like a lot of gaming nowadays, in terms of like making games, should be kind of focused on compromise for sure. And although I am, you know, somebody who just really does enjoy playing the game, and therefore I play a lot, and I tend to like obviously progress faster than the people do to that, I still, like, obviously, like, you don't want anybody to feel like super left behind, because the game just feels way better when more people are playing it, right? And you know, I don't want it to be a prohibitive experience where people feel like they basically can't play the game because they don't have enough time to play the game. That was actually the case with OG Vanilla WoW, where a lot of people that I talked to in terms of like why you weren't playing the game, they basically just thought that it was too much of a time commitment. They wouldn't be able to put in the amount of time required, and I totally get that. So I think like doing anything that you can to kind of like limit that feeling and help buffer it a bit of, oh wow, the FOMO, we're missing out, we can get to the content in time, etc. It's definitely good, but it can be done by simply moving the raid back. And I feel like the issue with capping the level is that there's so much to do in this game, and a lot of it is kind of it's definitely, how would you say, gated by the level, right? Where there's some things that are hard gated, like the professions, right? You don't have access to like max level profession stuff until 35, so that's not going to be a thing for like the first month or whatever, based on what they said. And then there's things that are like soft gated, where even if you could get the you technically, I think like you can probably make sappers, I think, or is it 250? I'm not sure. But even if it was 225, getting like the mithril to make the sapper is gonna be really annoying, right? Because yeah, you could get it for sure if you had like a coordinated effort to do it, but it's not really very pragmatic. You're not going to be able to get a lot of it. It's going to be a big time investment, and it's probably just going to be a big pain. People are not going to want to do it, right? So it blocks off like a lot of the game when you do 1 to 25. And I understand that the point is that they're adding stuff to the game to give you stuff to do during that period. But to me, considering they're keeping it the same time to level 25, they said that it's going to be over a month until we get to the next phase, and that's kind of concerning because I think that a lot of people are going to be bored. And to kind of go into that in a bit more detail and get into kind of like the title of the video here, I know we're probably like 20 minutes in or whatever and getting to the title, right? But I think that the whole like level cap thing and them trying to like make the end game, they're trying to give us like an artificial end game sort of, and I think that is trying to fix like unavoidable problems in video games, right? And the first one that I kind of already touched upon is that with the FOMO stuff is that people who play more will always have an advantage in these types of games over people that play less. And I think, like I said, it's great to try and look at the situation analytically and think like, okay, like what's a logical way we could intervene here to make the gap not so bad that doesn't feel bad for like the people who do invest a lot of time, right? And I think that the starting the later is like a great kind of compromise there, because the other people can still do other things, right, in the game. But ultimately, you're not really ever going to like nullify the advantage that just like spending a lot more time in the game is going to give you, right? So
what now?
I think you have to be really careful when you try and like overinvest into ideas of this nature, because the desired outcome is probably not going to be what you think it's going to be, and you could end up pissing people off. And I'll kind of get into like why I think that how I actually think that this could, the level brackets being how they are, could actually really hurt casual players in a second. But the other aspect to it, in terms of why I think the level cap thing is like a bit weird, is they're trying to like, there was this whole thing with hardcore, right, where people love the idea that the game, quote unquote, didn't begin at level 60, right, and they could just like play the game at any level and like, just like they basically had fun again, just like playing their character through Darkshire, for example. And I understand kind of like where they're coming from with this, where hardcore did sort of have that vibe. But the reason why hardcore wasn't focused on endgame is because the endgame for hardcore is like basically impossible, right? And you're gonna be like, oh well, what about Amphi and his guild? They full cleared Nax, and they full cleared all the raids, and they did all the world bosses and stuff like that. And like, yeah, obviously, if you're having like a super coordinated group of people who are like relatively proficient players, and they kind of, they're willing to put the time in, they're willing to farm the consumes, they're willing to reroll. The game is not rocket science, right? And you will be able to, get through the content and clear it all most likely. They could have wiped. And maybe they would have won again. I feel like the whole Petri thing being in the game did definitely remove a lot of the the worry there, because you're able to just like do kind of close to full resets, especially if you have multiple Petris on each person. So it's not as much of an issue. But basically, I would say for the average player that's playing hardcore, it's just not even tenable to think about the end game, really, in terms of playing it for a long period of time. Even the people that did the challenge for the first Naxxramas, you have to understand that it was a challenge, right? That is the point. So what I mean by that is like a lot of them are not playing anymore, right? Or if they are, they're playing when they want. It's not like they're necessarily trying to get full bis on their characters in the same way that people would in a traditional WoW season or something like that, or they're not really playing for like the long term, if that makes sense. They made their characters, they had a specific goal in mind. I'm sure some of them are still playing, but it's probably not at the capacity that they were. You know what I mean? And for most people with hardcore, the challenge has nothing to do with rating, and it's literally just getting to 60. That was the original challenge, right? And I think the whole raid challenge just kind of spawned off of like, okay, well, we're going to do this challenge. We're going to have a bunch of people at 60. We completed the first challenge, so now we might as well go into the raid, right? But nobody is looking at hardcore as like a sustainable server. You know what I mean? That's why people have been asking for new era servers, right? Because hardcore was a new era server, but they don't want a new hardcore server because obviously, hardcore is just untenable to have for a server in the long term, because people will die, like they'll lose all their stuff, and it's just like the price to pay in a game like this where it's so easy to die is kind of just too much. That is one thing about Classic, where the game is relatively easy, but it is punishing, so it doesn't really mesh well with hardcore. But people they found that like thing where, oh well, I like just playing through the game. But it's like you like playing through the game because that was the only thing you could do in your mind. That was the challenge. Everything was like, oh, I'm in this zone, I'm present in this zone, I need to survive this zone, get to the next zone. You know what I mean? It was kind of like a step-by-step progression to level 60 for a lot of people, or wherever they stopped playing, wherever they died. Whereas if you have an actual season, the end game is the end game, basically, right? So they're not like, everybody is always going to have that in the back of their mind that like eventually we're going to get to level 60. And since the game's going to be completely persistent, your character's going to persist on death, and presumably people are going to want to play the server for a bit, then you're always going to run into this problem of the end game. Now what they've tried to do is they've added a quote-unquote end game raid to level 25, right? A level cap raid. But here's the problem, is that we all know that the raid gear is going to be completely replaced by like the next, whatever they do for the next bracket. You know what I mean? I think it's been announced that it's going to be 25 to 40, 50, and then 60. So if they release like any sort of raid or new dungeon content that drops new gear, pretty much all of that stuff is going to get replaced by the next tier. Now it seems as if there's some power creep from what we've seen base of the loot from the BFD or whatever. So when you get to like level 40 or 50, it's possible that like some of this stuff, may kind of like last you a bit. And Classic itself is kind of notorious for it doesn't necessarily spread the love out very well across all your slots, right? So like you may have like Trinket is the kind of like the most obvious one, right? Where a lot of people tend to go into raid with like really bad trinkets, aside from like the specific very good trinkets that are kind of easy to get, or the Dire Maul trinkets, assuming Dire Maul is in the game at launch or whatever. But that's usually like the weak slot in a traditional vanilla experience. So these raids could help shore up some of that. But by and large, you're going to replace like all the gear that you got in the instance. And it's one thing, like in some sense, that's what every tier does, right? In raiding. So you might be looking at that and you're kind of like, well, so does it matter? Like, hey, we're still going to do this, we're still going to have fun. And I would say it matters a sense in that the difference in like item disparity is going to be probably huge. You know what I mean? Like going from Molten Core to Blackwing Layer. Well, Molten Core doesn't really have great gear. So a better example would be actually going from Blackwing Layer gear to AQ 40 gear for most classes is not really that insane. There are definitely like some really good iconic weapons, trinkets, and stuff like that. But barring those things, some of the sets are not even itemized that well, right? So the gap in power is not that big. So a lot of your Blackwing Lair stuff is still relevant even into Nax, essentially. So that feeling of like my time being respected because I actually like went and I farmed this gear out of Blackwing Lair, and now it's still kind of benefiting me until I get something better in Nax or whatever. That's a thing in vanilla that I love and I think a lot of people like. And I don't think that's really going to be true of the lower level dungeon gear necessarily, or the lower level raid gear. It's basically just all going to get replaced when the next raid comes out. And I think another thing is like you could say it'll help you level, kind of like how when a new expansion releases and you have like the best gear from the prior expansion. I think people can kind of like view it like that as well. But the issue with that is that, first of all, it's never really like a requirement to have the gear from the prior expansion. And, it's faster with the best gear. Like how much faster is kind of like the thing that I'm curious about. And, with the innate power that you're going to get from the glyphs and the fact that this is vanilla. I mean, granted, they did say they are going to buff mobs in the open world, but they're explicitly only going to buff the damage they deal, and some classes actually do really well in terms of not actually taking a lot of damage if they pull mobs like one-on-one to begin with. So I think it's just going to be like really overkill for the leveling, and it's not really going to be super helpful. I mean, yeah, melee class getting like a weapon in a place where it struggled to get a weapon before, that'd be great, but I just don't think it's going to be game breaking, and it's almost certainly not going to be worth like investing the time to like fully get bissed out on a character in terms of like this is going to save me that amount of time leveling into the next range. So I think that basically, like, no matter what, people realize, right, that the game is eventually going to 60. And although I think there will be a lot of hype to do the instances at first, just because they're kind of like new and stuff like that, I don't really see it as being the same as like a phase. Like I don't necessarily see people being as motivated to grind out like BFD every 3 days or whatever. Right, make sure they get their lockout on cooldown. I just don't really think it's going to be that important for a lot of people. And the rewards from the Ashenvale thing are kind of nice, but you have a mount that's only usable in Ashenvale, right? And then you have like low-level PvP rewards. I think the main thing with the Ashenvale thing is being able to get your Warsong reputation up, especially if they're going to add new Warsong related items at max level. That could be nice, right? It's a good way to get your reputation up there. Maybe they'll do something similar with like Arathi Basin or something like that at a PvP event later down the road that gives reputation towards that. So those things could be interesting, right? And you may be incentivized to do those things because when you hit level 60, maybe you'll have the reputation already like mostly finished, or you'll have it exalted even. But beyond that, unless you're actually doing things in the game that are going to count at endgame, you can't just make whatever you're doing now endgame. That's what they're trying to do. They're taking level 25 content and they're calling it endgame because the level cap's 25. But we all know the level cap's going to get raised. All that stuff's going to be forgotten. And you're not actually making any meaningful progress that's going to benefit your character at the max level outside of like the reputation for the battlegrounds, right? And even that is kind of a bit, whatever, as AV is typically the one that everybody wants to have rep in, and I don't even know if there will be anything that will come up along the way that will give AV rep. And in terms of, like, I guess AB is kind of decent because there's some good stuff from there, but Warsong was definitely like the weakest, I'm pretty sure, of all of them. So, there's just not a lot of incentive there. And I guess my point is you're never going to take away the focus on endgame in a MMO because inevitably that is what the game becomes. You play the game to get stronger, to get better gear, to level up, to get to the max level, to do content, to continue to improve your gear, to be able to PvP, to be able to kill harder bosses, etc. And that's kind of like the fundamental game loop, right? And the only way you could really break away from this, I think, is if you had a game where, if you like, maybe you had a game like New World, for example, where you didn't have a level cap at all in the game. I guess you could do it in WoW too, but like you would say like none of the stuff in the game was contingent on you being level 60 or 65, right? And you could just at any moment go and work on a profession to your heart's desire. Or like, in New World you would have like the only thing that would matter is like the weapon levels. So you'd have levels and individual systems, but you wouldn't have like an overall class level that would essentially gate you from be able to hit the max in all those systems, right? And the moment you have an overall class level that's gating you from doing things, from either fighting certain mobs that you need to kill for gear or accessing certain zones, stuff like that, then the end game is very clearly defined at that point, right? And renaming BFD the 10-man end game is not going to change that, I guess, is my point. And you're basically trying to solve a problem that is impossible to solve, whereas like when an MMO gets more, as the time from launch progresses in an MMO, less and less people are going to be at the lower levels, and that's just, it makes absolute sense, right? Because there's going to be more people at the MMO launch, and eventually they're all going to get to max level. So the earlier levels are going to be less populated. People are going to make alts, but less people make alts than people have mains, right? And then the people who have alts and get those alts to 60, there's going to be even fewer people then they're going to make a third alt, right? And then you're not getting typically as many players in they're not willing to join 3 months into an expansion or something like that. So you're just kind of like artificially gating things, which I'm sure they're aware of. Like they wouldn't contest that they're artificially gating anything, but it doesn't really solve the problem because once everybody moves past that level bracket, it's still going to be an issue. And I would say, when you move from 25 to 40, it may not be an issue for the 25. Like, there may be people still running the content at that point to some degree. But even then, it's like, do I just want to, do I want to invest like 4 hours to possibly get some gear out of this BFD? Or do I just want to fucking blast leveling? You know what I mean? For those 4 hours and get a couple levels. And maybe I'll even get an upgrade there or something like that. Or I'll find a drop or something. You know what I mean? So I think like immediately once you move past the 25 point, things lose a lot of their luster. And then once like there's level 50 in the game, and now how many people are going to be running BFD? You know what I mean? And because people had such an amount of time to level alts in the first phase when kind of everybody was doing it and everybody was running BFD, so therefore like it would be easy to get their alt gear and stuff like that, there's probably going to be less people actually leveling alts later on than there would be in a normal version of the game, right? So you've kind of just shifted around like when people are leveling their alts, essentially. And everything is going to die out anyways. You know what I mean? There's no secret sauce. There's no creative design solution that's going to fix any of this. Like, as a server progresses, it's going to lose more players, and its leveling population is going to dwindle. It's going to be harder to do the lower level content. And I think that the only thing that really needs to be taken away from that, from a development perspective, is, we have to design the content in a way where it can be soloable. Or if it's not, if it's something like Original EverQuest, you'd have to have a team that goes in and kind of like fixes on the fly. Like, okay, now the content needs to be adjusted to be soloable later on to account for the lapse in like player population. Right, and those are the only things you really need to take away. Like, you don't need to like try and like create some solution that's not a solution like they did here. You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of like the main topic of this video in terms of being unable to fix like a problem that's just completely unavoidable. And one last thing I will say, because I promised to come back to this, is so why do I think that this doing it like this could actually hurt players? Well, like casual players that they're trying to essentially protect. Because keep in mind, like the whole genesis for this is they want the guy that's got, he's like a dad to like 8 kids and he's got 17 jobs or whatever, and he can play for like 30 seconds a week. And this is not flaming anybody or anything like that. I just like the hyperbole that people do with that meme online. It's kind of funny, but I get the point there. And the problem is that the hardcore players are going to abuse this system by making an insane amount of alts. They're going to care less about doing the raid, and they're going to care less about doing like Ashenvale or whatever, because they know that none of it matters, essentially. So they're just going to create like an alt army essentially for professions, and they're going to have an insane economic advantage over players that don't do that. And the casual players are going to be less likely to do that, right? Because they are going to, like, first of all, they just have less time to play, right? And then, second of all, a lot of their time playing is going to be, like, they're going to be playing the game as if the end game actually is the level 25 dungeon and Ashenvale. And the hardcore players are going to be playing as if the end game is the actual end game. So when we get to the actual end game, there's going to be kind of like a giga gap there. And you could say that there's always going to be a gap, which is something I talked about earlier on in this, right? That's very true. But I think that this particular system for how you're doing things streamlines how to like min max for hardcore players so well that you're gonna see like the biggest economic disparity that this game has probably ever seen when season discovery hits late game, right? Because I feel like normally when you hit 60, there's, even if you're one of the people who, like, I hit 60 pretty fast usually on servers, and at that point there's kind of like a branching tree of what you should do, right? And there's an opportunity cost for everything, unless you buy gold, right? Which unfortunately is a huge problem. Botting, we can talk about that in a separate video. But if you do that type of shit, like, it obviously, like, what I'm saying here doesn't really apply, but I'm trying to go from like a normal player's perspective. You know what I mean? So you hit 60 and you can choose to go do dungeons and get gear, but every dungeon you're in, you could be like farming gold or doing professions or doing something else, or every profession or you're doing or gold farming you're doing, you could be getting more gear from dungeons and stuff like that. So what a lot of people do for the normal era servers, right, is they're hyper obsessed with getting full prebis. Like, they think full prebis is like, you know, the bee's knees. They don't care that, you know, they get like a 3 DPS upgrade from this cloak to this other cloak. Like, they want it because it's bis. So they will run strat like an insane amount of times to get this cloak, right? And the opportunity cost there is that they're actually throwing away a lot of their lead that they had on the like the casual player, right? Because the casual player is never going to be super obsessed with bis, and especially pre-bis, right? Especially by the time they get to max level, because people are already going to be running raids. So they are going to get to max level, they're going to get as much pre-bis as they can to essentially get invited, and then they're going to start accruing raid gear. And, you know, they may pick up more pre-bis as the game kind of goes on, but that's kind of going to be their progression path. Whereas, like, the guy that's like the hardcore player that's obsessed with having all his pre-bis, you know, the second week of Molten Core, the third week of Molten Core, because he wants to like pump out every last little bit of damage, you know what I mean? He is shooting himself in the foot economically, essentially, because he's spending so much time in instances chasing an upgrade that is effectively worthless, but he'll never admit is worthless, right? So that's why, like, I don't obsess over this stuff to the same degree that other people do, and I love getting my economic foothold started early. But in this situation, the only thing, like, the most obvious thing you can do is get your economic foothold started, right? Because it's so clear that none of this stuff is going to matter late game, that I feel like the people who are going to, like, the hardcore people who are going to obsess over getting, like, full bis level 25 is going to be way less than the hardcore people who obsess over getting 60 pre-bis. Because it's going to be, like, so short-lived. You know what I mean? And there's going to be people like, you know, people will probably make fun of you for being like, oh, I'm the top parser in BFD or something like that anyways. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think that this is going to be kind of like a disaster for the casual player in a way, because people are just going to have, like, so many resources, like, stockpiled by the time people get to 60, that they're just going to be, like, so behind if they're playing the game like Blizzard is intending them to play it, essentially. So I think in that way, it kind of sucks for them. And I think that this change is, like, even though the intentions are good, and I understand the thought process and the reason why you would try and implement it like this, I think ultimately it's just not going to work out well. In addition to the fact that I think even the casual players will most likely be bored of doing BFD probably 2 or 3 weeks into the thing. They're going to want to level. They're going to want to get closer to whatever the next thing is. You know what I mean? So we'll see how this goes, but I think there's a lot of experimentation being done this season. Not a fan of all of it. Like, I'm sure I'll still have fun anyways because, fresh is fun. I'm not really super concerned about fun, especially because I have a plan for everything and kind of what I'm going to do. But, yeah, I could see it being, like, kind of a frustrating experience for some people later on if they kind of drop the ball too much early. So, we'll see. And, I guess that's my thoughts. So I'll make more of these as we find out new information. Like if there's significant stuff that comes out that may change anything that's said here, I'll make always happy to talk to you guys about stuff. So I'll make new videos. But until then, thanks for watching. It was kind of a longer one. A lot of the stuff is going to be, much more, I would say, concise or to the point. This is definitely a more long-winded style, like ranty video. So, yeah. I will talk to you guys later. See ya.